delighted to welcome you to this, the latest in our series of inaugural lectures here at the University of Leicester. These lectures are an opportunity to celebrate not only the many successes of the lecturer, but also the good fortune of the university in having been able to secure his contribution to the scholarly life of our institution. And I'd like to offer a particularly warm welcome to any of you who have come from outside the university and who are visiting us this evening. Congratulations above all on making it through the snow, and we're delighted to have you with us. Glenn joined the School of Education as a senior lecturer in 2006. Before that, he had been director of the English Language Institute at the University of Surrey and the head of the School of Linguistic and Applied Language Studies at the University of Dundee. The focus of his research is on language testing and the philosophy of educational assessment. He has extensive experience of test design and has worked on a number of major development projects. Glenn also edits the premier journal in the field, Language Testing, which is published by SAGE. He's an active member of the International Language Testing Association and has served as president of that association in 2006. Recent research has focused on both technical and social aspects of assessment. These include the design of rating scales for performance tests and the ethical and legal aspects of testing practice. His 2009 paper on the use of tests for secondary purposes won a Best Article Award from the International Language Testing Association in 2011 for its impact on the practices of examination boards. Glenn's books, particularly Language Testing and Assessment, which was published in 2007, and Practical Language Testing, which was published in 2010, are among the most widely used texts in teaching language testing. And his website, languagetesting.info, has been described as a one-stop shop for information on assessment. As a result, he has received an increasing number of invitations to lecture internationally. In the last few months, he has been visiting distinguished lecturer at Temple University in Japan and has addressed the Academic Forum on English Language Testing in Asia at Xianjiaotong University in China, which is the organisation of Asian examination boards. Glenn had a somewhat unusual start to his career in educational testing and assessment. Before undertaking his doctoral studies in applied linguistics and assessment, he completed a bachelor's degree in divinity and a master's degree in theology. Now, you may feel that there's quite a distance to travel between these early studies in religious studies and his current interests, but clearly there are links. One thing that an academic needs is a source of intriguing titles for his lectures. And those of you who have knowledge of biblical texts may well have spotted what I took to be a reference in Glenn's title to the book of Daniel in the Old Testament. Of course, I may have got this entirely wrong, and what we have instead is simply evidence of a well-spent youth in the company of a pile of vinyl, listening to records by Johnny Cash. Or maybe there's another explanation. Maybe we shall find out in the course of Glenn's lecture. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to invite Professor Fulcher to give his inaugural lecture, which is entitled When the Man Was Weighed as in a Balance, Assessment of Social Science. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very, very much for such a wonderful introduction. And thank you to everyone for coming tonight. I thought that I might be talking to one or two people who I would have to usher into the middle because of the bad weather. So thank you for everyone for coming and really working your way through all that snow and misery out there. I hope it won't be like that tonight, even though some people assume that those of us who work in testing and assessment like inflicting misery on others. Yeah, Janet's nodding, but it isn't like that at all. Now, you may, of course, make notes. You don't have to, but you may, because there could be a test later on. But of course, if you do make notes, no copying from the person sitting next to you. That's not allowed. Now, testing and assessment. I spend a lot of my time thinking about testing and assessment, and some people, some colleagues, think this is incredibly sad. But this is not at all true. Not sad in the slightest. And one of the things that I get to do, which is rather wonderful, that Elizabeth referred to, is to do a number of consultancies. And a little while back I was doing a consultancy, and we'd finished discussing what we had to discuss for the day. And we went to the formal dinner in the evening. And the host at the dinner stopped us about halfway through and said, "It's time for a toast." And I'm used to toasts for people and for projects and so on. But he stopped and he raised his glass and he said, "The toast is better tests for a better life." Well, you may find this bizarre, but there is something in this, because in the recent past, validation theory has actually been changing quite radically. Validation is about the inferences that we draw from test scores to the meanings of those test scores in real life. And the changes started really in the late 1980s with the work of scholars like Samuel Messick, who started to move us away from looking at the purely psychometric aspects of testing and assessment and towards the social consequences. And that's been changing even faster. In 2007, Fred Davidson and I introduced the concept of effect-driven testing. The purpose of our coining of this term of effect-driven testing was to try and say that the mathematical and psychometric and purely psychological aspects of testing, while still important, are subservient to and servants of the larger purpose of the effects that the tests have on the people who take them, that is, the test takers, on the institutions that use them, the people who use and interpret test scores, and on the society that provides the mandate for the use of those test scores for those particular purposes. And this moves us away from this purely psychometric and psychological aspect towards the wider view that assessment is part of a wider, broader social science, the way in which tests are used to achieve social purposes. In my view of effect-driven testing, the meaning of the test is its effect on the people who use it and the people who take it. And we start, instead of with a definition necessarily of purely psychological traits, but with a definition of the use it is intended to fulfill in society. We then work back and say, when we design these instruments, how do we design them in such a way that we will have these intended effects? And so validation has moved away from this purely psychometric aspect to include things like the ethical considerations of what we do, the impact, the washback it has on the classroom, on the lives of individuals. The philosophy of assessment, where do these ideas come from that lead us to design tests in certain ways? The legal frameworks within which we operate. At the end of last year, we learned that various groups were taking the government to court over the GCSE English fiasco. What are the legal parameters of cases like that? Politics. Politicians are always dabbling in education and testing, as we know. What are the politics and the policy issues around assessment? Decision-making and risk. What are the risks associated with making bad decisions? And of course, the history of assessment and use. Now, to start this discussion for the next hour or so, testers always want to keep people in rooms for longer than necessary, but I will try not to. Let's start off with a definition. People nowadays, when they write papers, always try to keep their references to the last 3 to 4 years to show that they're up to date. I like to encourage people to put references in that are at least 100 years old to show breadth of reading. My favourite definition of testing and assessment is this one from Francis Isidro Edgeworth. He was writing in the late 1800s, and you will notice that there are two important aspects to this particular definition. The first one is that what we're about in testing and assessment is sorting people. It's a species of sortition. We are sorting people into various categories. Sometimes we want to spread them out over some kind of scale according to psychological abilities. At other times we want to sort them into categories, maybe in terms of mastery or non-mastery according to a particular criterion related to a particular domain from which we want to draw inferences. But it is a species of sortition, and we can't get away from that. We are separating people. Often, people don't like the idea of that, but it's what we do. And secondly, it's preferable to casting lots, which is making decisions by pure chance. We try to remove the randomness of decision-making. Now, I'm sure lots of you will know, and here is where there is another reference to my theological past. Many of you will probably know that the best example from literature of casting lots for honours and offices was when Judas Iscariot made a very, very poor career move that affected not only his immediate prospects, but eternally. And he had to be replaced. And there were two candidates, Matthias and Joseph, and they cast lots for which ones would take Judas's place, and Matthias got it. Now, the one thing we know about Matthias is that we never heard of him again. He's not mentioned again in Christian literature. No one even penned an apocryphal book in his name. So they clearly got a bad decision by chance. What Peter needed was a test of apostolic aptitude. If they could have defined sainthood and the necessary key skills that would make that up, they could have made a better decision. They were not thinking about what evidence they needed to make those key decisions. And that's the next thing we need in language testing and assessment, any kind of assessment. We think about what kind of evidence we need to make the key decisions and inferences we infer from test scores to abilities to perform in specific domains. What is the evidence we need to do that? The evidence, when we're considering the evidence, we have to think about the quantity of evidence we need to make reasonable decisions, like placing people in jobs. We need to think about the quality of evidence we need, taking into account the risk of making incorrect decisions, which is where I share this interest with many people in my school. Risk and risk assessment, and the consequences of making poor decisions if the risk is very, very high, balanced against the cost and the resources required to collect that evidence. What we do in testing and assessment is an abstraction from real life. We create tasks that people do, and I'm sure that you've all taken tests where you sit in a room and perhaps you select one answer from 4, or tick boxes, or write short answers. This is not what we do in real life. But we assume that the responses to those abstractions tell us something about how you would perform in a real life situation. So they are simplifications. And the process of inferencing from the scores to the real world domain, which is the process of validation, is what we are concerned with. When we get sortition and evidence coming together, we are discriminating among people. Now, assessment seems to me to be the only place in the entire universe where the word discrimination is still good. It's positive. That's what we want to do. We want to discriminate among people. But we have to discriminate amongst them based on the skills, the abilities, or the knowledge that from theory we predict is going to be critical to and predictive of performance in domains outside of the test. And when we do that, we make another assumption, and that is that testing is fundamentally meritocratic. This is meritocratic discrimination. So that those who have more of those key, critical skills, abilities, knowledge to perform in the domains, they're the ones who are going to get certified to do that job, to be able to perform in those domains. And those who are not will not be able to. And I think there is now virtually no profession that does not have courses to follow, examinations, and certification. In fact, I believe that when Michael Gove suggested that people may teach without a teaching qualification, there was uproar, and quite rightly so, not least because it would affect our futures. But it is fundamental to everything we do with discrimination and certification. When it comes to language skills and abilities, just think of some of the things that have come up over the last year. Issues like whether or not medical practitioners should have English tests before they are allowed to work as locums in the United Kingdom. Think also of every time you step on a plane and you are in the hands of pilots and air traffic controllers who are speaking to each other in a second language. And we need to be able to know that they are capable of getting us safely from A to B. Or, just to drill down a little bit, just on this one occasion, that we may wish to test whether or not they are sensitive to very fine differences in meaning caused by phonetic or intonational information that is carried in the code. Such as descend to 400, descend to 400. I want to be fairly certain that my pilot understands that distinction. And always has it been so. It's not unsurprising that the first book on education was also a work on political philosophy. In 360 BC approximately, Plato was expressing his view of utopia. And the way to achieve that political utopia that he was interested in was the educational system. And the only way to make that educational system work, to get the guardians out of the population and into the right places, into the right jobs, was through assessment. And so from the very beginning, we have one of the first tensions that occurs in education and testing and assessment. And that is that politicians have always been and will always be interested in manipulating examination systems to create the kinds of society that they want to see. And so it's not surprising that it's still happening today, because it was happening in Plato's time. The second tension in the use of tests in society is whether or not, coming back to my notion of meritocracy, is whether or not those tests are going to be used to maintain the social status quo, or whether they're going to be used, the testing system is going to be used for social mobility. So we have this tension as well, apart from the political to and fro, we have the tension as well between whether it's used to maintain the status quo or to create change. And so, in all of this, with discrimination and its use within the political system, tests are used for selection purposes, for choosing who is certified, who isn't, who gets jobs, and who isn't, and who doesn't. And with that, inevitably, comes competition. People will compete to try and get higher scores on tests. And we have known this for a long time. Here's my second very old quotation from a book called On the Action of Examinations in 1877. This reminds me of Boris Johnson's reference to the Olympics and how this should be an example of the way in which we could run our educational system. Whether one likes Boris Johnson or not, it's interesting that he is picking up on some of these issues. We also had in the last year the occasion when Nick Clegg went on the record saying that Cambridge should lower its entrance criteria for children from more poorly performing schools. That was a direct challenge to the notion that competition and selection should be linked. And I'm sure that you remember the uproar that there was over those comments, actually challenging the links between these ideas. So we have so far the notion of sortition, the use of evidence in a process of discrimination, the purpose being primarily selection for some reason or another, and the fact that that selection process leads to competition. One of my friends wrote a book a short while ago called Measured Words, Bernard Spolsky, and he called this the Chinese principle. And he called it the Chinese principle because the first large-scale tests were developed in China in the 6th century AD. And they were developed to select officials for the court and the country's administration. And they served two purposes. Firstly, to make government more efficient. And secondly, to bring the country's aristocracy under control. And it had the effect of expanding the middle classes in China in the early Middle Ages. And recently, in a lecture, Professor Pan Wei from the University of Beijing explained some of the principles underlying this. And I'll play you a clip from that interview.
Professor Pan Wei of Peking University, he says the party state, just like the old imperial dynasties, rests on four very Chinese pillars of good government.
Four pillars. One is the idea that the government should serve the people's welfare, all the people's welfare. The second pillar is a way to pick officials. And the third one is a politically unified governing body, a party. And the last one in China is a checks and balances through division of labor. So those four pillars have existed in China for more than 2,000 years. It's a Chinese system.
But the checks and balances that he mentioned through the division of labor, that could almost have been written by Plato, assigning people to the appropriate tasks. And ways to select those people for the positions. these examinations in China that started in the 6th century AD were held in examination halls which were purpose-built. And in the examination halls, along the side, were long rows of individual cells which would stop people talking to each other whilst they were taking the examinations. And we know a lot about these early examinations in China from the 6th century onwards because historical documents have been uncovered. And I'm going to read you just a little bit that gives you a sense of what was going on in China at this time and throughout the early medieval period. And you will be surprised at just how much of this sounds like exactly what you went through when you were taking examinations at school. As was to be expected, each candidate carried a large load because the examinations took place over 2 to 3 days. He needed not only writing materials such as an inkstone, ink, brushes, and a water pitcher, but also an earthenware pot, foodstuffs, bedding, and a curtain to hang across the entrance to his cell. As soon as the candidates, carrying their heavy loads, had entered the compound through the great gate, they were searched. 4 soldiers at a time frisked one candidate from top to bottom and made him open his luggage for inspection. It goes without saying that books were forbidden, and so was any piece of paper with writing on it. Since a soldier who discovered such a paper was awarded 3 ounces of silver, the inspection was most stringent. It is said that the soldiers went so far as to cut open dumplings in order to examine their bean jam fillings. Still, it was not rare to slip something past the strict eyes of the inspector. During the worst times, some people maintained that enough books were brought in to stock a bookstore. After this inspection, entry certificates were issued, but another search of personal belongings was made at the second gate. If any irregularity was discovered there, the first inspector, as well as the candidate himself, would be punished. After that, the candidates came to the Dragon Gate, in front of which lay the Grand Avenue, flanked on each side by the openings of the lanes to the cells. Each lane was identified by a large character, taken in serial order from the primer of 1,000 characters. After finding and entering his lane, each candidate located his own cell, identified by a number. Then he put up 3 boards and arranged his things. Since at least 10,000 men, at times many as 20,000, entered the compound and had to be searched, the procedure used up most of the day. This was large-scale testing in the early medieval period. And the elements of the ritual, the checking, this is the first signs of knowing that people are cheating on tests, and we're putting in place the security. Here's another picture of the cells. The rituals were beginning to become formed. You were only allowed to leave your seat once during the test. You couldn't exchange papers with anyone in an adjoining cell, and you couldn't talk to them. No dropping of papers, no talking, no changing seats, no humming. And incomplete papers were sealed so that no one could add to those incomplete papers. When the candidates took the exam, they were only allowed to write in black ink. When they had finished, the examination papers were collected, and there were copyists who copied out the entire examination paper in vermilion. Then there were proofreaders who compared the black copy with the vermilion copy. Any changes were written out in yellow, and the copyist and the proofreader then had to sign them off. 10 to 20,000 candidates per sitting. Okay? Then those were passed to the person who was in charge of the examination. Numbers were put, the same number was put on the black and the vermilion copy. The black copy went into storage, and the vermilion copy went to the examiners. the examiners marked in blue. Passing candidates then went to a senior examiner for checking, and random checking of failed papers was also done. Random sampling of failed papers. When the marking was finished, the marked papers went back to the person in charge, who then went back to find out who the candidate was from the number, and then posted the list publicly on the gates of the examination hall, so people would find out who had passed. Blind marking in the early Middle Ages for so many candidates. This was what drove the growth of the importance of the Chinese middle class and of the civil state. By the 11th century, all the instruments of impartiality were in place. But with the usual English modesty and cultural myopia of the traditions of other countries, the Cambridge historian Roach in 1971 thought that they were discovered by the Victorian gentleman. Well, at Leicester we don't make mistakes like that. We know that they went back a lot further. But what Victorian Englishmen did do was to understand the Chinese principle via Jesuits who were coming back from China, and they took it and did exactly the same thing. They used it to change, they used tests and assessments to change society and to cause the expansion of the middle classes, or not enable the expansion of the middle classes in Victorian England. But in England, it was much, much more controversial than it had ever been in China. I'm not sure whether Oscar Wilde was saying this with tongue-in-cheek or he actually meant it. But we do know from the writings of Edwin Chadwick in the middle of the 19th century that when the introduction of the competitive examination for both schools and the Indian civil service was being discussed in England, Lord Grey got up in Parliament and spoke against the use of examinations in our schools and for the civil service and for the army. And his main argument against examinations was that they did not take into account moral character. And what we really needed to do was to say with the feudal system of patronage, which did. In other words, we keep on appointing to senior posts the sons of the aristocracy. But people like Chadwick and Matthew Arnold and John Stuart Mill were not having that. But this controversial nature of examinations continues today. I'm going to go back to the Victorian period, but I just want to bring you up to date to show you just how controversial the use of examinations in our education system and for selection purposes and for discrimination still is. People who object to the use of tests and assessments today normally go back to the work of Foucault. And for those of you who don't know what this is a panopticon. It was invented by Jeremy Bentham. It was in the middle of a prison, and it was invented because you didn't even need to have a guard in the centre of this watchtower. None of the prisoners could see each other, and none of the prisoners could see the guard in the centre of the tower. But if there was a guard there, he could see into every single cell. And when Foucault wrote Discipline and Punish about prisons, he had a chapter on not language testing and assessment, but on testing and assessment. Not particularly language, but on testing and assessment. And this was Foucault's view of testing and assessment. This is the second bit I'm going to read to you, and it's the last. The examination, he wrote, combines the techniques of an observing hierarchy and those of a normalizing judgment. It is a normalizing gaze, a surveillance that makes it possible to qualify, to classify, and to punish. It establishes over individuals a visibility through which one differentiates them and judges them. That is why, in all the mechanisms of discipline, the examination is highly ritualized. In it are combined the ceremony of power and the form of the experiment, the deployment of force and the establishment of truth. At the heart of the procedures of discipline, it manifests the subjection of those who are perceived as objects and the objectification of those who are subjected. The superimposition of the power relations and knowledge relations assumes in the examination all its visible brilliance. Who will write the history of the examination? Its rituals, its methods, its characters and their roles, its play of questions and answers, its systems of marking and classification. For in this slender technique are to be found a whole domain of knowledge, a whole type of power. I've been portraying the role of testing and assessment in society as one of introducing meritocracy, and I've been giving very positive examples. But Foucault turns it around and he says, no, what we're doing is imposing our views of what counts, of what matters on people in schools. And we're finding ways of saying this is the knowledge that we value. And only those who value the same knowledge are going to get into positions of power. But as I said, that's not how the Victorians saw it. For them, it was a matter of middle-class education. It was a matter of expanding access. And as I mentioned, people like Matthew Arnold wanted to use this to level social distinctions. And that was precisely why there were so many voices against some of these changes during the Victorian period. None of my lectures are, well, I never get through one without a quotation from John Stuart Mill. As, of course, my students in the audience will know, John Stuart Mill creeps in somewhere my philosophical hero. Once again, Mill had a vision of utopia, just like Plato. And his vision was universal suffrage. And he saw the purpose of the education system, driven by the examination system, as creating the conditions for the expansion towards universal suffrage. Another vision of utopia. And Lord Macaulay, who introduced the 1853 India Act, which started opening up the British civil service beyond the aristocracy, believed that by creating this competition for selection, we were doing precisely that. Meritocracy. Since then, especially through standards-based education, testing and assessment has spread everywhere in society. There is almost nothing we can do without taking tests, being assessed, and receiving certification. Testing and assessment has become endemic. And at that point, I think I said at the beginning that, no, actually, we're just taking a few seconds out to look at just how endemic it has become, with one or two statistics thrown in.
this morning, gonna take a big test. Couldn't sleep, my mind's in a mess. Oh, I'm so nervous, I'm as scared as can be. But I won't let the fear get the best of me. No, I won't let the fear get the best of me. I'll tell it, I'm gonna beat you, gonna defeat you. I'm gonna do my best. You think you got me, you'll never stop me. I'm gonna pass this test. Fear, you're nothing but a big fat pest.
Be quite content to do my best. Someone else can do the rest. Do the rest. Pass the test.
Pass the test. No need to ask who are the best. Pass the test. Better than the rest. Pass the test.
Cheating. Wonderful. My favourite cheating quotation also betrays a philosophical interest, which was but people will always cheat. And the reason for this is that test scores and certificates, within this framework, this social framework that we've created for them, have an economic value. And as long as they have that economic value, then people will cheat. And there is a lot of research that goes on into avoiding cheating. At this point, I might also throw in that testing and assessment also generates lots of satellite industries. One I came across recently, I beg your pardon, those are two examples from China, again, very, very early examples of crib sheets in the hand and shirts that they used to wear underneath their outer garments, complete with everything they needed to know in the examinations. So it's been going on for an awfully long time. With the satellite industries that tests create, this is one that I came across recently. I think it's only evolved in the last couple of years. This is again from China. Online praying sites where immediately before examinations you can go onto the site, you pay a certain fee using your card, you enter your prayer to one of the two Buddhas, one who represents confidence and one who represents wisdom, and as long as you've paid, then presumably your prayers are granted. But whether this counts as cheating or not is an entirely different matter. But it is going to happen because what we have done in this whole history of the development of assessment and testing is to create a meritocratic view of the world which links meritocratic access with material success and with motivation to learn. And indeed, it's difficult to imagine an alternative to it. This is an absolutely fascinating quote from E.M. Forster. Is this system actually superior to the old way of lazy, spiritless patronage, as Professor Galbraith once put it? A writer in 1924, urging us to improve written examinations, put it like this: educators seem to be agreed that pupils tend to accomplish more when confronted with the realization that a day of reckoning is surely at hand. Oh, yet another theological reference. Politicians and economists have picked up on this. Edwin Chadwick, writing in 1858 on the progress towards the introduction of competitive examinations in England, said, "We really must do this because it will allow us to hire fewer people to achieve the same economic output in the public service and private sector, to improve economic output with fewer people. It will allow parents to select schools for their children without wasting their investment. And it will allow us to select soldiers for specific tasks, to make wars more efficient." Weber, writing in 1947, also wanted the introduction of tests to improve the performance of industry. The technology for this was being developed apace. This is a photograph of Sir Francis Galton's anthropometric laboratory at UCL at the turn of the 19th century, where he was beginning to develop the technologies to put this into place. But where were these technologies tried out? Well, surprisingly enough, during war, exactly as Chadwick thought they would be useful. During the First World War, 1.7 million men took tests, a whole range of tests, different batches of tests, in order to make the war more efficient. Of course, at that time, they thought it was psychology, pure psychology. And this little poem written by someone at the time will give you an idea of what they thought they were doing. "The valiant, bespectacled psychos are we, prepared to assign every man his degree, and the place he's best fitted for in the army. By psychology, Bill Kaiser will shake in his throne across the sea when he feels the earthquake of our efficiency." It's bad, isn't it? "Pencils up, forward march to the great victory of psychology." Well, at least it gives you an idea of the faith they had. It was also the time of the very first large-scale English test. All of the non-English speakers joining the American army were given a battery of English tests. Those who passed the tests were given a rifle and sent off to the front, and those who failed were sent to a language development battalion. Probably the only test in history where you had an incentive to cheat and fail, right? But this was where it was tried out, and we still have all of this data from these. There was a group test, and this is an image of the invigilators giving instructions at the beginning. There was appropriate security for high-tech test administrations, and here you can see the dividers between the desks. Nowhere near as sophisticated, of course, as China 1,000 years earlier, but we were beginning to get there by the First World War. There were also individual tests as well, and the group tests were being correlated with the individual tests, and then cut scores established on the group tests to make them more efficient based on the data from the individual tests. So we were getting to the stage of thinking about how we could simplify them. Notice also the new scoring techniques that are being developed here for large-scale testing. We actually have here, this is a picture from 1917, and these are sheets of acetate with scoring on, so that they could put them over the papers to speed up the scoring process. And the outcomes, you won't be surprised to hear now, related to trying to establish cut scores for people who were at different levels, held different ranks within the army. And this is an example of an early attempt to draw the distributions of scores on these tests by men in the army in the First World War, to be able to predict and then use those tests for discrimination and for selection. Today, our concerns are with uncertainty in measurement. We want to be able to increase our ability to make good decisions and reduce risk-taking, but also to reduce unfairness in use. And we do that in a range of contexts. Research is going on at the moment to look at issues like air traffic control, call centres and other businesses where second languages are used, and failure to use language efficiently and accurately is going to lose business for those companies. The military, trying to work out which soldiers have the aptitude for training in Afghan, for example, so that they can actually talk to people on the ground. Higher education, as all of you know, lots of you will have taken examinations like IELTS or TOEFL before being granted access to higher education. Legal and medical interpreting. These are high-stakes contexts where miscommunication have serious consequences. And of course, testing and assessment, and particularly language testing and assessment, gets into the news a great deal. Here are just some of the stories that have got into the news in the last year. It's amazing just how often I switch on the Today programme in the morning and there is a testing story. That was an interesting one, fight to keep asset languages. There was a view that if the tests were abolished at the end of last year, then asset languages would no longer be taken seriously in schools. The motivational power as well. But it's not researched properly. So, in what areas are we currently researching at Leicester? Well, we're looking at contexts, principles, and practices. In this lecture, I've been focusing on contexts, the historical, social, political, and philosophical frameworks of language testing and assessment. Because through effect-driven testing, we believe it is these things that we should take into account when we're looking at principles and practices. We should be looking at what kind of society we want, and the role that testing and assessment plays in building that. And I hope that some of the historical insights I've been sharing with you will give you a feel for how that actually happens. At the next level down, we're interested in processes, principles, and concepts. Things like validation theory, reliability, how we build tests to reduce the element of chance in decision-making, how we get rid of the randomness. And then at the practical level, what knowledge, skills, and abilities we need to actually build tests and to try them out. Last but not least, the quotation from the book of Daniel which I must admit, despite my theological background, I had not remembered. This is where it came from. And once you are just reading that quotation from Wordsworth, I'm going to play the last little clip, which comes from that well-known musical, Standardized Testing, the musical.
How does a teacher know students are wise? How does he give out the prize? How does he know if he does not test? Testing, testing, when you are unsure. Testing, testing, a 1, 2, 3, 4. Testing, testing, it's time to know for sure.
That's incredibly memorable, isn't it? Anyway, I decided to play that at the end because a lecture like this, short of bringing a guitar with me, it was the only way I could finish the lecture on a high note.
Well, high notes indeed. Thank you very much indeed for a fascinating lecture and a scholarly lecture. It's not often, I think, that we have a tour through from the Sui dynasty, through the Scottish Enlightenment, Max Weber, into the 20th century, E.M. Foster, and ending up with Woody Allen, I think, in a surprise appearance at one stage. So thank you very much indeed for that. I hope that many of you will be able to join us across the way in the Charles Wilson building for refreshments. We'll be convening on the first floor, and you're very welcome indeed to join us. We look forward to seeing you all there. Thank you again very much indeed.